How is it possible that a study that created all of these product lines as a result of its hype, that got 9 times the hair gains of Finasteride, also produces 5 times lower satisfaction scores from participants and no before and after photos? The following is a live presentation from inside of our membership community. Now, twice a week, I will host these live events. They are presentations on topics about hair loss, hair growth, new studies, best treatment practices, picked by our members that I then build a presentation on, present, and then we host a live Q&A after the call. And we've decided to make this specific call for free. So if you're looking for this level of support, community, connection, and you want to connect personally with me, join our membership community and you can do exactly that. Check out the presentation and I hope you enjoy it. In this presentation, we are going to dive into all of the ways that researchers and marketers can cheat hair counts in their clinical studies and present to you biased results. And the best way to illustrate this is to start with a hair loss study that broke the internet. And no, I'm not talking about Kim Kardashian. I am talking about a hair loss study that came out back in 2016 that forever changed the landscape of hair loss products that were available to consumers. It's responsible for all of the products you see on this page and dozens of more. The study was on a very popular ingredient called copper peptides. The study took 45 men with androgenic alopecia and it sorted them into one of 3 groups. One group got a higher dose of a topical containing copper peptides, another group got a dose that contained half of that, and then the third group was just given a placebo topical to apply. So after 6 months, what were the results? They were absolutely insane. The copper peptide in the higher dose group saw a hair count increase from 109 at the beginning of the study to 161. The other group saw a hair count increase from 90 to 161. And the placebo group saw an increase from 120 to 130. And if we were contextualizing this in terms of the changes in hair counts, those are insane. We're talking about nearly 50% and upwards of 80% hair count increases for this treatment. Why is that crazy? Because Finasteride, the gold standard treatment for hair loss sufferers, only increases hair counts by about 9.2%. And if you don't believe me, look at this really well-designed study that showed in the results that Finasteride increases hair counts by about 9.2%. Here's what a 9.2% increase in hair counts over 2 years might look like. Here are the patient satisfaction scores that are associated with that. We can see in this column here that basically patient satisfaction across a range of questions for Finasteride is about 70% or higher. So think about this. If a drug that gets you a 9.2% increase in hair count that then results in a 70% satisfaction score and before and after photos that look like that, imagine what a copper peptide that gets you an 80% increase in hair count. It must be a 99% satisfaction score, and the before and after photos must be insane. And so it's very normal to then make the assumption that copper peptides are probably better than Finasteride, right? Wrong. Let's look further into that copper peptide study. First, let's dig into the patient satisfaction scores. Now, as we can see, this is a 4-point scale for patient satisfaction. Group A and Group B were the treatment groups, and Group C was the placebo group. Scores of poor to fair are shaded in yellow and green. You can see these right here. And basically, those are considered generally by most practitioners to basically be a non-response. You're looking for good to excellent scores. When you add these numbers up, they're not 99% like you'd expect. They're actually something like 14%. So only about 14% of the people trying that product, the copper peptides, were even satisfied with it. Now let's look at the before and after photos. So again, these before and after photos with 80% increases in hair counts should be insane, right? Wrong. There are no before and after photos. There's none at all. How is this possible? How is it possible that a study that created all of these product lines as a result of its hype, that got 9 times the hair gains of Finasteride, also produces 5 times lower satisfaction scores from participants and no before and after photos. That is what this presentation is here to reveal. So we're going to talk about 3 ways to cheat hair counts in clinical studies, why hair counts are basically meaningless, and how to interpret hair counts in any study effectively, because there are things that you are going to want to know that we'll get to in the next couple minutes. So first, let's talk about cheating hair counts. Well, what is hair counts anyway? The definition is basically a number of hairs in any given measurement area. So we can see right here that we have a 1 square centimeter zone and the hair is shaved, and you can use statistical tools and softwares to basically count all of those little dots that represent hairs in this area. And in fact, if you look closely at the center, you will see that there is a tattooed freckle right there. And these measurements are used with these kinds of tools, these dermatoscopes and phototrichograms. And the reason why you tattoo that freckle is because you want to be able to elicit hair count changes across time. And that's the change in hair counts before and after you do some sort of hair loss treatment, but you need to keep the area fixed. So if you look at these photos, A, B, and C, you'll actually see that that tattooed freckle is perfectly centered in all 3 photos. And this gives investigators a really objective way to measure in the square centimeter zone that they're testing how much hair growth there is. So this is really objective, and it's one of the best ways to evaluate a hair loss treatment. So how could you possibly cheat something like this? Well, one way is to group together what are known as vellus hairs and terminal hairs in your final hair counts. So really quickly, androgenic alopecia looks like this. In men, it often starts as temporal recession, diffuse thinning, and a bald spot at the crown. In women, it's usually diffuse thinning with retention of the hairline across the scalp. And androgenic alopecia progresses through something known as hair follicle miniaturization. It looks like this. So over a number of hair cycles, the hairs get thinner and thinner and thinner over time until they're so thin and wispy that you can barely see them at all. So basically, it's the diameter of the hairs and their length of growth that change. Now, out of all these hairs, these ones over here tend to be the visible ones on somebody's scalp who's experiencing androgenic alopecia. And the ones over here, these ones tend to be invisible to the naked eye. So you can see them under a microscope, but you can't necessarily see them in person when you're speaking to somebody. And these visible hairs are largely considered terminal hairs, and these invisible hairs are largely considered vellus hairs. So if you looked at a scalp, you would see a combination of these hairs in any specific zone that's undergoing androgenic alopecia. So this is a photo from Dr. Donovan. This right here represents a terminal hair. It's not miniaturizing. This hair is in the process of miniaturizing. And then this little thin wispy hair right here is a vellus hair. It's in the end stages of its baldness process. So really quickly, a vellus versus terminal hair. Vellus hairs generally often don't contain any pigment whatsoever. They're less than 40 micrometers in diameter, and they're less than 30 millimeters in length. They do not grow very long. So you can look at somebody's scalp like this, and it can be filled with vellus hairs. But if you zoomed in, they'd look like this, but at a cosmetic level, they're completely imperceptible. And that's why vellus hairs don't account for cosmetic hair growth. So great researchers are going to exclude them from their total hair counts when they're doing these studies. And that is exactly what this Finasteride group did. They measured terminal hair counts, only the hairs that actually account for cosmetic changes to hair density. And as a result, that 9.2% increase corresponds with results like this over 2 years and satisfaction scores that are this high. So how do we get an 80% increase in hair counts alongside low patient satisfaction? It's really easy. We just include those vellus hairs that are not cosmetic in our hair count total changes. They look like this separated. They look like this combined. Many things are going to stimulate vellus hair growth. Very few things are going to stimulate terminal hair growth. So you look at these scores and you look at these numbers, you see great congruency here. 9.2% for hair count increase, 70% patient satisfaction. That kind of visible regrowth. But in the land of copper peptides, 80% increase in hair count, 14% patient satisfaction. It's incredibly low. No before and after photos submitted by that investigation group. Those numbers lack congruency. And in my opinion, that means they included invisible or vellus hairs in their hair counts. Probably. I'm alleging they don't make it specific in the study. So to recap, researchers can cheat by grouping together vellus and terminal hairs, or they can do something else that's really sneaky. They can just change the definition of the way they think about vellus hairs. That last one, we're not going to get into in this presentation. But that is not the only way that researchers can cheat. The second way is to load a study with people who have really aggressive hair loss cases or who are at the end stages of balding. So the Norwood scale is a way to measure balding across men. And it looks like this. It's a map to basically gauge what severity you might be at. On the one side, you have very little hair loss. And at the Norwood 7 side, you have advanced hair loss. So let's look at somebody at a Norwood 2, for instance. They have many terminal hairs. And somebody at a Norwood 7 doesn't. They have few terminal hairs. Say that both people undergo the same exact treatment. So let's say that this person is Norwood 7 and this person is a Norwood 2. And we decide that we want objective hair counts on these people. And so we measure a point right here. And just for simplicity's sake, let's say that this point is equal in both cases. It's the same mapping area on both scalps. Well, at a microscopic level, you might find maybe 5 terminal hairs in this person's scalp. And at this person's scalp, you might find 100. So we've illustrated that here. We have 5 hairs and 100 hairs on the same scalp. And the only difference really is that there's a delta in these terminal hairs because their hair loss is so different. One is very severe, the other one is at an earlier stage. So let's say that they undergo treatment. And after 6 months, they come back and they've applied a topical, and that topical has netted them 2 more hairs in this area that we're measuring. So we can see the 2 hairs highlighted here in a seafoam green, and then also highlighted over here. So now we're looking at plus 2 hairs, and that brings our total hairs for this person to 7 hairs total, and it brings our total hairs for this person to 102. And in both cases, neither of these results are cosmetically significant. You can't really tell a difference according to global photographs. But let's look at the percent change. On one side, we have a 40% change in hair density because 2 hairs from 5 gives you 7, and that's a 40% increase in hair. But on the Norwood 2 side, we only have 2 hairs that brings us to 102, and that's a 2% difference. This is a perfect example of why people who are at more advanced stages of balding should maybe be reconsidered for massive indexing in hair loss studies, because all it takes is a very tiny increase in slick bald areas to give you an obfuscated hair count change result. And keep in mind that in both of these cases, the results are going to be cosmetically insignificant. So, do you want a great study result? Stack your study with people who are Norwood 6s, and then only report the percent changes in their terminal hair counts. You will end up with something that looks like this, and the more people in this category that you can eliminate, the better your outcomes. That is something that I've seen in a few studies, and it's certainly something to call out in this presentation. The third way that you can cheat hair counts is by marketing sleight of hand. This isn't even the fault of the researchers. Have you ever seen a chart that looks like this? Or a chart that looks like this? This right here is a chart of a product called Revian. It's a laser light helmet. And they show their hair count improvements over a 16-week period. And they compare that to other red laser devices, and then they compare that to minoxidil and finasteride over different time frames and different studies. They make it look as though this product is the best one that you could buy. What marketers aren't going to tell you is that when they build charts like this, which is from Neostem, it's another device, and make these comparisons to minoxidil and finasteride, they are not going to actually tell you that these are from different studies. This is one study. This is a completely different study on a different patient population and time frame. And this is a completely different study on a different time frame and patient population. You cannot make hair count comparisons like this across studies. Why? Because a ton of things affect hair count changes. Let's just go through a few of them. The first is just how long you run the study. The study duration, if it's 3 months, is going to have less hair counts, all else equal. If you run it 12 or 24 months, they could have more. The study start time also matters a lot because there's something called hair cycle seasonality, where in July and August in the Northern Hemisphere, people actually go through accelerated bouts of hair shedding as a result of changing circadian rhythms and UV light exposure. It's really, really, really complicated. Researchers don't fully understand it. But if you start your study in May and then you end it in August, you're basically going to see a downward trajectory, all else equal, for patients in that cohort because they're entering into a phase where shedding is going to ramp up. So you really need to focus on this. Another thing are the patient demographics. I mean, we just went through Norwood gradients, but age, ethnicity, and gender also influence your starting hair counts and most likely your response to different treatments. Age-related senescence alopecia is where the hairs will generally thin over time, even in the absence of a hair loss disorder like androgenic alopecia. There's different hair counts across ethnic groups. Genders have different hair count starting points before hair loss begins. And of course, there's that Norwood gradient problem, which we earlier described. There's also just the way that a researcher might want to count the hairs. Are they going to include the vellus hairs or are they going to exclude them? Are they going to define vellus hairs the same way or are they going to define it differently across studies? And another point is, are your differences in hair counts, are they going to be measured from baseline hair counts in the treatment groups? So where they started versus where they ended? Or are you going to measure the delta between the treatments and the placebo at the end of the study? All of these things have a massive influence. And perhaps the last one, and one of the ones that is most complicated to explain, is even if you have a study that does all of the above and matches everything perfectly, the measurement place points for your hair counts have to be very, very well controlled, because even when you match for Norwood gradients, you can have wildly different ratios of vellus to terminal hairs and thereby responses to any treatment depending on your scalp zones. We published a study about this, and this is one of the figures from this study. Look at all the dense terminal hair follicles here and look at the vellus thinning hair follicles here. Just 1 millimeter difference of reference points for hair counting is going to give you a completely different baseline hair count and thereby different results. So if you want to check out that study, here it is. But the bottom line with this is that you cannot make hair count comparisons across studies. They are mostly meaningless, and yet marketers do this all the time. Now, with all of that, how should we interpret hair counts? How do we do this? Well, you can try to account for all of these factors that we just discussed, which would be exhausting and require a ton of time on your hands. Or you could take a different approach. You could simply corroborate whatever hair count changes are reported in a study to the before and after photos in that same study. This is so much simpler and it is so much better. It's also a method by which we use to calculate one of our key treatment metrics, which is regrowth potential. And if you want to learn more about that, I will link you to our treatment metrics page. But the table by which we evaluate treatments looks like this, and we have a massive compare treatments tool that does this work for you. In fact, it is the way that we standardize across all of the treatment guides and the ingredients databases inside of our site. So use regrowth potential. It is going to be a much better tool for making these comparisons between what a study result might suggest and what a real world result might look like for you if you try that same treatment. All too often, we see studies that show incredible hair count gains, but they never corroborate them with photos. That's usually an indication that the study has some sort of design flaw. You want full completeness when you're evaluating any of these studies. You want the terminal hair counts. You want the hair density changes. You want to make sure that these things are calculated properly. But above all, you need to be able to corroborate that to investigator assessments, patients' self-assessments, and before and after photos that are submitted. If any of those other components and endpoints in a study is missing, you are probably not reading a very well-designed study, and you should take the results with a grain of salt. By the way, if you want to learn more about this, we have a 55-minute video diving into all of the ways that we routinely see hair loss companies cheating their clinical trials. And we go so far beyond just the hair counting methodologies. Okay, that's everything. I hope you enjoyed this presentation, and I hope it benefits you and helps you in making treatment decisions.